I think the last couple weeks, microdosing in terms of high quality work is kind of exploding on social media. And obviously, the conference or the seminar in Denver really accelerated a lot of these exchanges on Twitter. And I think it's really important to get a little bit of a background on high quality work and how to dose it properly. And your term microdosing is something to kind of, I think it's generating a lot of momentum. I think if you could explain some of the origins of what's going on with the loading process for the listeners, and then hopefully John can get into some of his own experiences as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out right off the bat that when we talk microdosing, we're not talking performance enhancing drugs or LSD or some other thing that we shouldn't be talking about. But the whole idea was it seemed like an appropriate term to talk about smaller, discrete opportunities to stimulate the athlete, much smaller than you would conventionally do, and do it on consecutive days. And this, again, that Denver conference was great. You get all these people together: Dan Paff, James Radcliffe, Lauren Landau, Brett Bartholomew, and we actually had a very good audience in terms of the IQ. So the discussions were very, very high level, and that was a good experience for me. And I think everybody benefited from the exchanges. But what came out of it was like, what's this idea of microdosing? How can it work for me? Everybody was, including the first presentation when Jim Radcliffe talking about we have to start looking at periodization differently. And people are still stuck on these methods of like, we have to slog through the first general prep phase and we have to do all this endurance work and build this base, where he's like, let's just get into it. What do we need to do? And I think the microdosing is part of this. Like, let's get to the speed, let's get to the elasticity, let's get to the skill. Otherwise, if we wait too long, there's not enough time to get it done properly. So I know from my personal experience, when it first hit me was when we went into taper periods, and you know very well the taper periods for swimming, track, and field, and this idea that they always called it unloading. And I thought, well, Charlie brought it to my attention that on consecutive days we can still do high intensity elements because the volume's relatively low and you don't get this accumulated fatigue effect from the central nervous system. And I said, yeah, okay. And then, of course, the athletes look really good. They look fresh. They run well. They personal best. And then you're like, why don't we do this all the time?
Yeah.
So that's where it was born out of, these types of discussions. And then I know John has some similar experiences, whether it's circumstantial or whether it's a theoretical approach that we've modified.
Yeah, my experience with microdosing is largely began as being circumstantial, like with the Cara hours that limit how much contact time you have in the college level. When you're working with a sport, a lot of coaches are probably going to direct that time to working on the sport. So I still need to sneak in things to complement whatever they do in practice. And I wasn't going to be able, that was a battle that I wasn't going to be able to win, trying to like reorganize practice schedules so that I could have an hour and a half or 2 hours in the gym. So I needed to start to get creative about how I distributed elements over the course of the week within a shorter time frame, and really pick out what matters there, right? If they're already getting some of the things that they need from practice, then what do I sneak in so that I can continue to get them adapting without needing as much time.
I like that. I'm going to steal that. Just I'll have it on the record that I'm stealing the sneaking in. And it's sad that we're in the situation that you have to use a term like sneak in because you feel like you don't have access to those time resources or even the energy resources. It's sort of like you're trying to give a dog medication by sneaking in, a little speed work. And I think that's where a lot of the coaches are really starting to find that, you hear this great conference, you hear this perfect presentation, and a lot of times these coaches have been with the team coaches for 10, 15 years, and they have that ability to get in the year. And when you're on year 10 or year 11, yeah, you've earned your right to kind of modify things. But what do you do in year 1, year 2? So maybe if you could go into some of the top-down experiences that you've had with NFL teams of this whole sneaking in the speed work during the warm-up, I think that would be really interesting to the listeners, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as what John said. I don't care what level you're at. If you're dealing with a coach, and some are obviously better than others and understand what we're trying to do, but the tactical, technical objectives take precedence, right? So if you're working with a football program, they can't have enough meetings. They can't have enough video review. They can't have enough reps out on the field, whether it's team, whether it's individual. So you're always fighting this propensity to want to do more and saturate the brains of these young men. And so when you come in and say, "Can I have a little slice of that to do what we feel is important, whether it's speed work, whether it's some sort of recovery or tempo, stretching, warm up, as we've discussed," it gets very difficult. So you really are trying to slice the bologna very thin and go, "Can I just have this little slice here?" And so if you get that slice, you have one of two options. One is you can hammer the guys and increase the density, or you can be very specific and particular and give the proper rest and use it. So would you rather get 3 really good reps at something that's highly technical and highly central nervous system intensive, or would you rather get 20 reps of something that really doesn't transfer? So that's a conversation you have with first the strength coach, and then he takes it to the head coach, and we get the 5 minutes here or the 10 minutes here, and at the end of practice the extra 10 or 15 minutes as well. And then you have to be very careful with the players too, because they know that all their energy is being taken by the head coach and the position coaches. So now it's a multilateral negotiation. It's the head coach, it's the position coach, and then the physios want them over here doing this, and the trainers. And so you're sending the FTD flower bouquet 6 months ahead, so that they're like, "Oh yeah, he's a nice guy, maybe we'll listen to him." And when you come with that, they ask 6 months later, they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah." But yeah, your 5 minutes, you're nickel and diming in order to get these little pieces where you can have this stimulus that whether you call it signal, to separate yourself from all the noise. And that's what you're trying to do. It's a real negotiation. And I know John has had similar negotiations and sneaking it in and making it seem like something else, like, no, we're not doing tempo or conditioning, we're doing recovery runs, or we're doing, this is our enhancement series or whatever. So you have to sell it.
Yeah, for sure. Like, speed work is my go-to example when I'm explaining how I've integrated microdosing into my practices, and that just becomes part of the warm-up. And then making sure that athletes, are taking their time in between reps becomes, I want you to conserve energy for your practice, right? So it's a creativity involved in getting them to think that you're, not really doing work. It's not really a workout per se. It's just like a preamble to the practice.
Yeah, you're kind of going, "Hey, I really care about your well-being," but you're kind of saying, rather than, "Oh, it's because of the central nervous system neurological effect," right, you're like, "Hey, I just want you to chill, man." Like it's a real sales job, that's for sure.
No, those are some good selling points. I think that's the art, is trying to figure out a way to get what you need to get accomplished by either negotiation, sometimes a little smoke and mirrors. When you're getting more cooperation, can you give me some examples of, not cookie cutter workouts, but, like, for example, on the tempo stuff, there's been a lot of discussion on the value of low intensity work and, what does it do, warm downs, etc. How do you sell the warm down in 2017, Derek?
I mean, you really have to sell it not in terms of, some profound scientific effect, and you're not like, "Hey, doing the PubMed, handing out of research papers to the athletes." That's not going to sell, right? They don't have the time, nor do they care. But if you really got to sell it as how it sets them up for the next thing. like, okay, we're doing this, and within the context of, tomorrow, the next day, game day, and it's this whole I almost like it was funny. We talk about stuff like this all the time, looking out of the industry, but there was this YouTube series on Pixar on how to tell a story,
Yeah.
and they had interviewed all the people, and I'm like, this is fascinating, right? So you really almost have to tell a story, and you have a beginning, a middle, a climax, and an ending, right? And I think people understand it better if you're just like, hey, this is good for you, do it now. I don't think it works as well as having this story and this how all the dots connect. So, I mean, that's part of the sales job, if you wish. But that's how I introduce it. Is this is feeding into this, and these are the building blocks.
So the physiological journey, sorry to interrupt you, John, but the physiological journey, and maybe the climax is the game, and the ending is the day after, which is the typical, whatever they call it, regeneration day, which is always strangely, it's funny how one example to break the microdosing concept is, yeah, if you do a huge game, you're not microdosing the day after. I just don't get that. I understand where a lot of people are doing kind of like this stimulatory post-activation potentiation, type stuff the day before, which I don't understand how long that lasts. I mean, these are a lot of theoretical things. But I like that idea that you tell the journey so that people buy into all the parts of the story versus just what they're doing now. Maybe you, John, can go into maybe besides the speed work, because I think people see that as very natural. What things like plyos and lifting do you see in microdosing that really helps the team sport?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, over the last few years, I actually started to move more into the spreading out my elements over the course of the week. And it was just my way of satisfying the coaches that wanted the athletes to be in the gym 5 days a week, 6 days a week, without frying the athletes and making sure that I got something out of them every day. But it's going back to our reference of a strength coach being a salesman, it's a tough sales job for even an athlete to come in and conceptualize that doing 2 exercises, 4 doubles per exercise is a workout.
Yeah, and it's I'm going to steal something from Brett Bartholomew because he's really hot right now, and if we hashtag it Brett Bartholomew or Conscious Coaching, we're to get more viewers. But he said, look, my father was like an investment banker or investment guy, and doing these small little things are like having the direct deposit taken out of your account so that you actually have build up your 401k or your RRSP or whatever you want to call it, your retirement stuff, investments. But it's the same thing as we're trying to have these little withdrawals so that you have this compound interest of central nervous system energy that you take into the game. And I think this idea of like we're going to activate before the game, well, why aren't you activating the whole bloody week and building towards it rather than waiting and then it's time to donate, contribute to my retirement now at the end, and I don't have as much money left over because I spent it going out to the bar or buying coffee or whatever. You've been doing this all along, so that's the analogy I can come up with. But
yeah, Sean Windle from the Pacers. I sat down with him when he was in Boston, and he used the word drip. This, like where every day he's doing a little bit of work because everyone can give in and put that 20 minutes of work. It's just that when 20 minutes becomes 40 minutes, that's when like the brain starts telling you like, hey, I want to get out of here. And I also think that there is something to be said for certain times of the year where you're going to have to grind and you have to get in some dark places and get tired. But during the season where competitive schedules are becoming so focused on it, I think it makes sense that you have to really slice in our time more and just with more precision. Just thoughts on maybe the NBA season and some other sports like baseball, Derek. Maybe that might help a lot of the people that are not into the weekly rhythms like football and rugby and soccer.
Yeah, and that's that's a culture change too, in terms of getting people to shift towards actually working out in season. But I mean, I like your analogy, the drip, the sneaking in, like these are all, we're going to hashtag all these things. I got the Apple Watch because you got it, and I felt like, I had Apple Watch envy. And so I like the idea that I get notifications and just like a little titles, and then I can go, oh, I don't actually have to read the whole thing, but maybe that's kind of similar too. I'm not wasting my time on all this extra social media or text messaging, and I'm just getting what I need out of it. But as far as the NBA goes, I'm going to try to talk to Coach Vermeil and let him, give his 2 cents about it. But yeah, you really have to look at the time you have and get the players to buy in terms of, hey, I just need this much of your time. You come in, we get it done. We're going to rip the Band-Aid off rather than pull it off slowly, and you will see the effect as it builds through the season, I think. But again, the precursor is what is the relationship you have with the players, what trust do they have with you, and that relationship building before you get into something like this is pretty important in my mind, and probably the same with baseball. John can speak to that.
Well, we've chatted a little bit about how we implement it in baseball, and especially after all the hamstring pulls, the epidemic that it seems to happen mid-season onwards, and we kind of thought that the potential could be that they just aren't doing enough speed work. So how do you periodize that, even though we just said we were trying to get away from that? But how do you periodize that according to your schedule, where you're playing 6 out of 7 days a week, to microdose it on a regular basis so that you are always, that tissue quality and even neurologically is primed for sprinting, especially sprinting from in a sport where you're standing, not doing anything. It's non-circulatory. You spend the rest of your time sitting down, cold weather. All of these things come into play, right? So.
Yeah, and in my, like, I've been trying to push this whole signal and noise thing that we've been talking about, the three of us, and I'm really now leaning towards, we're trying to create positive noise by doing these microdoses so that the readiness is there. So like John said, the guy's sitting for an inning or longer or standing, but he's been so properly tuned and his training is so regular, his activation levels are always intact, that when he needs to go, he's ready to go, rather than, not doing any exercise at all, or trying to go, hey, we got a block here, let's just load him as much as we can. And then as soon as you take that away, then everything down regulates. So, it's just, just trying to hit them just a little bit here, a little bit there. Their noise levels are up. Now then when they need to create signal, they're ready.
So, well, I think there's a couple things to think about. Is also, let's get back to, not painting ourselves into the corner with, once you start removing time, volume, and some other things, you start to have very little margin for error, and you also have very little to play with. I'm not anti-microdosing. One thing I do know is that, once you start creating a discipline of warming up properly and doing as much as necessary versus as little as possible. And I think that's where it maybe the microdosing might be a nice entry point, and then on the off season, you can say, hey, listen, the reason that, we don't have much to work with is because I wasn't given much. And I think what we don't want to do is people to assume that this is a utopian situation. This is more of I would say, a little bit of a compromise, but also, even if you didn't have that compromise, your tapering is a wonderful example that, you don't want to go in there flat. There's a difference between fresh, fit, and then fatigued. So I think a lot of this stuff is a little bit more complicated than, well, let's oversimplify it. And so if I just go low volume, I can do high intensity with any modality I want. So I can do a depth jump with 6 feet, between sessions because, it's microdosing because it's just a small volume. I think there's a little bit more artistry than just making sure that the volumes are low. And that's what always concerns me is that, as soon as you start simplifying it, the simple people will simplify it even more. And then soon it's just going to be bastardized. So maybe, John, if you could get into, what kind of, not rules, but principles we can follow to prevent some of this stuff from happening, to become, an overdose of microdosing.
I think it all has to be contextualized. There's if you know if you have a good background on an athlete, and let's say they are running a 30s, they're running 30-meter sprints, right? And you've seen that on a regular basis they run 3.9. So nothing impressive, but then all of a sudden through microdosing you're starting to get into the high 3.7s. Then you have to contextualize it that relative for that individual athlete, the 3.7 is very fast. So you have to now start thinking about how you manage that. Do you space it out? Do you reduce the volume there, or do you just again keep hammering it just because it's microdosing, and therefore we can do very little?
Yeah, there's different ways of looking at it. If you look at it from the contextual point of view, maybe microdosing is just optidosing, and what we did before was overdosing, like you said. But microdosing initially for me was born out of I would say challenging or non-optimal circumstances, and it was our response. Like you said, it was a compromise in our response to do something that fit the situation and the circumstances better. Now, is that good all the time? I think you can take some, instances of it and mix it into your training and just be more aware of what your dosages are. But certainly, I think it should. This is a concept that I almost want to get to sport coaches, and we haven't even talked about that. Like as performance enhancement practitioners, we're very conscious of it. But maybe a sport coach could get something from it. Like I was having this conversation with Lauren Landau about swimmers. And, you're from a swimming background, and this idea that you need feel of the water. And if one athlete missed one practice, it'll almost take a week to come back to getting that feel back. So is the volume in swimming the necessity, or is it the frequency of contact in the water? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very specific medium. I mean, the feel of the water, you have some people that, there's a book called Gold in the Water, which is one of the best sports books I've ever read. And it was just an example of the feel of the water. Is it the signal or the noise? And I think that's, for my own belief and my own experience as a swimmer, when you're out of the water for a while, it's not like you forgot how to swim. It's just those sensations, your brain it just feels awkward. And I think that, each athlete's different. Some athletes just have a natural feel of the water, and some athletes just, you can tell that they're always going to be the second tier. I think that comes out with everything. I mean, just if you look at running, for example, our warm-ups for tempo days and speed days are very similar. And what I want people to always feel like they can be ready at any day, not any given Sunday, whether it be, because you never know when you're doing rounds and it's multiple events, you just need to be ready. And I always like that idea that at any given moment, when you're not feeling at your best, your body's used to at least giving me a short burst of something. I'm not calling it that grandma strength that, the grandson's working underneath the Toyota Camry and it collapses on him and she lifts it up. I think that's a little bit different because that's more of arousal. I just think that, some sort of rehearsal way to say, hey, can you perform when it counts at any time?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I actually just wanted to make a comment. Like you said that swimming wasn't signal or noise. I would argue in what the example that Derek gave earlier, where we're trying to create a little bit of noise in order for you to be ready. The feel of the water is in itself a bit of noise.
In terms of the feedback qualities of feeling the water, and then maybe there's a spectrum, and let's work on a diagram where you have signal on this end and it's a sprinting foot strike at less than 1/10 of a second, and then you have all of these other mediums, whether it's long distance running over here and then swimming over here, but it's a spectrum of signal versus noise, and it all depends on the medium you're working with, whether it's the ground, how long you're on the ground, how long you're pushing somebody versus water. right? I don't know, but that seems like a pretty interesting.
And I think that's with all sports. I mean, if you look at some guy that is, getting a certain amount of swings in the batting cage, everyone has their own idiosyncrasies of what's necessary for them to be in harmony. And, there's a couple things I've been looking at right now because objective measurement, these are all great ideas. But at the end of the day, before this becomes more buzz or, quote, noise, what we really want to know is, like, how do we know that we're really doing a good job? Because I think that when you have a collection of athletes in a team, we have to have general overarching patterns to get a whole team to function properly. And we also had to have little nuances for each athlete so that they can be finely tuned. And so I've been looking at, a lot of people know that I'm a big fan of iThlete for the heart rate variability, but I'm still a very cautious fan of Omega Wave because of DC potential. The brain is a very difficult organ to measure. It's hard to be distilled to one number. I'm not saying that is the case with Omega Wave, but I think with all the stuff like the neuropriming and all the stuff that's out there in brain, there's True Brain, a supplement company that's releasing, neurotransmitter support products. And with the brain becoming a little bit more accessible, I think that we have to do a lot more work to make sure that the methodology of training is better. And I've said this plenty of times to a couple of coaches that are asking about, the Halo product. And I said, listen, if it's an enhancing tool, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it's like having a microphone to a jackass. Like the last thing we want to do is amplify signals that are poor. So if you're a bad teacher and you're getting primed and then the athletes are getting coached by some moron, well, that's only accelerating the wrong direction. So I think it's really important that the methodologies, not necessarily the technologies, with anything, even microdosing as a general, it's a intellectual property that seems very benign at first because, it's just low volume training. You got to be careful because stuff like tendons don't remodel as fast as maybe the brain recovering from, some sort of, float tank or something like that. I think we have to understand that all the stuff is mixing around and it can be abuse. So maybe if you have any principles, John, that of where we can go back to on classic training principles that can really help kind of guide us better, that'd be really excellent for the listeners.
In terms of general principles like individuality, I guess, I feel like that's a little bit of a cop out, to be honest. After that,
I can't believe you're copping out.
At least I admitted to it, but I feel like it's a little bit of a cop out, especially after you put it and highlighted the importance of being able to implement this in a team setting, right? So,
but even like how everybody does, like, I do 3 building blocks up and then I drop for 1 and I build up 3 and 1, and like, don't you think like using a microdosing approach and being careful about the volumes, having more of just a very subtle undulating, or I don't know. Like,
certainly. But that's just based on what I see, and
it's not predefined.
It's not predefined. It's certainly not predefined, and it's like I said, based on what I see and based on me looking at what we were able to output on a given day. And I will also say that the number of athletes that I would work with per session hasn't been too large over the last few years, right? So I've worked with groups of 8 or less.
Because we were just at U.S. Air Force Academy, and they're going, well, like, we have 160 guys on the field. How do we watch them? How do we do this? 200 guys. So that's definitely a good point.
So, yeah. I don't know if like the thing is, I think that and Carl, you were saying it with the measurement of heart rate variability, or maybe other correlates of readiness, or whatever you want to call them. A lot of programs are already doing that. We're already doing that as part of it. So maybe we use that as a general barometer of how training is going, maybe through phases where us coaches can control a little bit more of what's going on. So like a January through March for a football program. I think that is what has to be leveraged in monitoring, like you said, because maybe the principle of individualization doesn't really apply to the individual itself as much as your situation or your program.
Sure. And Derek, to wrap things up so that we're actually microdosing the podcast, can you get in some final thoughts, maybe rehash a little bit without just repeating yourself from Denver?
I think the general consensus among the people that were presenting and the people that were attending, we all had the same message in terms of looking at what's in front of you. Like I have this quote that I used, and we used it in Virginia, was, if you're, it was a Lao Tzu quote, or if you're living in the past, you're depressed. If you're living in the future, you're depressed, right? So you got to live in the present. And I finished with that quote, and hopefully it captured some people's imagination. But the whole idea is you have to kind of live in the present with all this stuff and see what's in front of you, like directly in front of you, rather than going, well, this is what we did in the past and this is what has worked, or I want to be here in the future. And just like John said, see what the cards are in front of you and play those cards. I think that's probably the most important thing I got out of interacting this weekend.
Well, based on my stomach growling, I'm probably going to be overdosing on my dinner. But I think this was a great starting point, and it really ignited a lot of things, especially what you just said, which is focus on the present. Because what happens is that a lot of people will read a research study and they say, well, I'm going to start next season. I'm going to be planning how to increase my mitochondrial biogenesis, and what happens is you forget that eventually you're going to have to play a game of poker at the table, and the stakes are high. It's easy to build in the future or reminisce about what you did in the good old days when everyone was durable, but this is what we have to deal with is today. So
yeah. And I just want to say, like, the two people on social media who kind of supported what we're talking about was Mladen Jovanovic and Todd Hargrove. Yeah. And they started saying, well, what papers are there, and sometimes that's annoying when people say that, but obviously it's something that we want to look into more closely. And I know you and I have shared some papers back and forth on neurology and neural noise and all that. Yeah. And I think to take a quote out of Pat Davidson's mouth is like, we have to look outside of our industry to find the answers for this.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's the stark reality is that a lot of there's a Louise Burke, I think it was sort of like a letter to the editor, which is saying, that you win a Nobel Prize like in the 1920s when you're doing human physiology, you're not getting that same type of not that it's a talent pool, but you're not getting that same urgency to focus on sports performance that you are getting into something a little bit more applicable to the masses. So that's something to be said. Pat was definitely hit that on the head there. So good stuff, guys. I really learned a lot, especially with John giving me the what you do. I mean, there's nothing more important than sharing the workouts versus just talking about the science.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity again. We'll post this up very soon, and I'm again curious to see what kind of reaction and where this goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot more that can obviously. This could be a second podcast. So if you weren't hungry, we could probably keep chatting.
Yeah.
But
well, I'll come back and microdose again.
Okay.
We'll get you some snacks next time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.